What's eating you? Seriously, do you know? How do you know if you do not know what you are eating? What happens if you put fuel into your gas tank of your car if your car doesn't need it? If your tank is already full and you put more gas into your tank than what your tank can hold, what happens? Well, it used to overflow. However, there are governors or sensors in place so that your tank will only hold up to a certain amount and will take no more. Our bodies are designed in much of the same way. We have governors put in place. Our brains release hormones signaling to our stomachs when it is time to start digesting the food we have eaten. This in turn signals a message through hormone function for us to stop eating. But many of us do not know what to look for or ignore these body signals. We eat our heart's content and pay for it after in symptoms that signal to us that something is wrong, such as diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, not to mention weight gain. And I know this to be true because before writing this book, I was overweight, sick, and on the verge of some serious diseases and illnesses. I was a mess, and it took God to get me to see myself for what I was doing to myself, as nothing else worked. I tried the dieting crazes and the fitness fads, and yes, they work, but for a time. And nothing compares to the message that I share with you today, because it will alleviate all of your problems that you have with food. This information puts to rest the dieting and fitness crazes for good. I truly believe that after hearing this message and reading my book, Body and Soul, The Necessity of Food, your life will be changed for the better forever. I want your lives to change. We need change. We have never been in such a state of needing God now, more than ever before. We all know He's coming back, and now is the time if we want to become participants at the marriage supper of the Lamb. The time is to start readying ourselves now. There is so little time left, but guess what? There's enough time for us to invoke change, and I want you to start thinking differently about food, because food is not meant to be so complicated. The only reason why it is complicated is because it no longer is what God created food to be. So let's go back to discussing GMO foods for a little bit. What does God say about sin? He says that when we use one part of our body to sin, we corrupt the entire body. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this concept can be used with our standards of food sources today. GMO foods dominate the scene, and because of what GMO foods are, can we say that food we are eating that has been genetically altered, is it pure? No, it's adulterated by contamination. And many people will say that crossbred foods are also contaminated, but crossbred foods are not contaminated with a chemical source that is not biological in design. I know wrong is wrong, but right now we're in a position where we have to pick our battles. We have to pick our poison. It stands to reason, through the way of creation, that GMO foods are the worst poison than selecting foods to be eaten from selective breeding. So please, let's not splice words here. GMO foods are adulterated and they are contaminated. And it does not matter if the vitamin content outweighs the chemical content. What was once an apple may still look like an apple, but because of what was actually put into it, it no longer is an apple. It only looks like it. And it is an apple of lesser quality. Would you drink your iced tea if someone put a drop of Roundup in it? Certainly not. You'd throw it out because of the contaminating qualities of the toxic chemical. The little bit of harm within the chemical is toxic enough to do even a small amount of damage because of its potency. The little bit of bad cancels out the good. The little bit of harm overpowers the bigger portion of benefit. There is a reason why we are told to stay away from people who are of the world. It is the same concept. It is because of the potency of the corrupting ways of evil. We cannot decontaminate the world, and as hard as we try, we cannot win the battle over to our side. What does God say? He says that the corrupting ways of evil will eventually corrupt us, and this is because of sin's potency factor. This potency factor is in anything that is negative, and this is why it makes sense when it comes to applying God's word to contaminated food. The contamination doesn't come from God. It comes from evil. GMO foods are worldly foods, as they are the earth's food sources that have been corrupted by the hands of worldly people. These people who choose science as their all-knowing and all-seeing God and believe the fact-finding principles contained within scientific discovery, all the while denying the deity of God. It is the world that provides us with the tempting apple and whispers in our ears, "There is nothing to worry about. Surely you will not die. This is only an apple for science sake. Taste it. Is it not sweeter than before?" And I'm trying to imitate a hissing snake. But I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to say here, is that this is nothing more than just a lie told to us all over again, just like the serpent lied to Eve. And just like she did, we too have fallen from grace. But just because we've fallen doesn't mean we can't get back up. The value of food is not contained within its palatability. How food tastes should never be a measure used to determine whether it is good enough to eat. This has been used as a means to manipulate and lie to us today. The lies of manly influence by evil stop here. Today, I'm going to reveal to you the truth about food and bring God back into the details, as man has manipulated food to take God out of the details of food. Today the veil becomes lifted so that God can be lifted high. Today is where food no longer will have a hold on you, and you will see food for what it truly is, as God intended it to be. Today, you will be given information, and this information is dangerous because it is information that will wrestle within your soul. It is information that calls you into accountability, as it is information that reveals your responsibility, because once you know, you can no longer claim innocence. You will not be allowed to stand before God and say, "I'm sorry, God, I just didn't know." This information, you can't just try and then go back to the way of your current living. You have to try to understand and implement this information to the best of your ability, because this is a lifestyle change, and this is what your Christianity is. This information is what separates us from them. the world. And this is information that has been hidden from them, not you. This information is why dieting doesn't work. It's why people become slaves to fitness and slaves to their food and slaves to their body. The more they try to control food, the more controlling food becomes. This information releases you from every dysfunctional conflict that you have with food. I know I'm living it. For 3 years, I have been living a lifestyle change, and I have no desire to go back. I do not crave the things that I used to eat. I do not crave mashed potatoes, meat and gravy. I do not crave donuts and cakes and cookies and chips and pop and popsicles. I do not crave any of that stuff. And it's because I value the importance of what food is now supposed to be. I understand food correctly as it always was meant to be understood. But I fought God. I put off writing this book. This book should have been written and should have come to you, to the public, a year ago. But I struggled in writing it, and I put it off because this book was a personal account. It caused me to become personally accountable to the lifestyle I was currently living. It called for change within me personally. And I know this book is going to do the same for you, so get ready, because it may hurt. It's beneficial and it's for your good. And I am here to help you. If you need help walking through this lifestyle change day by day, I am here for you. You are welcome to talk to me. My email is available for you. It's in the book. My phone number's in the book. My mailing address is in the book. If you want to talk, I am available to you, because we are all in this together. I am not trying to hype this book up. This is a lifestyle that I want to be clear that I have been living, and I continue to live it. And it has made some people upset, but I see the importance and the value of the reasons why we all need to live this lifestyle. We all need to start living this way, and change will come. Just give it time. God calls us to come up out of the world and be separate from it. And this information is the game changer that does this. So, let's get to the Bible basics about food. We have a misconception already about food. Food is meant to keep us healthy. But food is not the source of our health. It may appear that way because science has dissected food, but initially, without the knowledge that scientific discovery provided about food, we would not be any the wiser of food's nutritional content. Now, keeping this in mind, food in biblical times was used to help keep us mindful in reverence to the one who created us and sustains our health through food. Why do you think the Bible likens itself to food? It's because food has life-sustaining qualities about it, and to the ancient Hebrew, these qualities were unknown. They were secret and hidden qualities in food. All the Hebrew knew was that the food kept the body going, just like God's word keeps the soul going. God's word holds us upright to Him, and food keeps us upright in life. The words of God have a source. The food has a source. It all comes from God. Did you know that the Hebrew culture was centered on food? Just read the sacrifices performed, and you will see some startling revelations about it. When you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself, must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 4 through 5. The Hebrews neglected to observe the sabbatical years and eventually were given over to Babylonian captivity. For 70 years they neglected to recognize the Sabbath, and for this reason, for 70 years they were subjected to King Nebuchadnezzar's rulership. The Hebrews were allowed to live freely, but not in any way that they previously had lived. They could own land, they could hold down jobs, they could even marry Babylonian citizens, but they were not permitted in any way to observe the laws of God. And how they kept God's laws was through one startling observance: food, or barley, to be more precise. The Sabbath years could not be observed without this once-a-year food observance, because this food observance was the barley harvest, and this was how the Hebrew could create their calendar. This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Then Moses said to the people, "Commemorate this day, the day you come up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out of it with a mighty hand. Eat nothing containing yeast. Today, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving." Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. The Hebrew translation for Aviv means young head of grain. And this is extremely important, as the new year was dependent on the ripened barley crops. We recognized our new year January 1st. But this was not so according to the Hebrew. We today can generally make a calendar 5 to 10 years in advance. The Hebrews could not do that because of the barley harvest. Their calendar year, the first day of the first month, was detrimental to this barley aviv. According to the direction of God, if the barley crops were not ripe, then the new year could not begin. They were stuck in the last month of the year. An extra month had to be added to that year, giving the Hebrew calendar an 11th month observance instead of 10. Once this particular date was set, then the Hebrew were able to count off the days to set times according to God's directed feasts. And Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, is counting days off from the new year, from the first day of the new year, and calling it Passover observance. The Israelites, or the Hebrews, could not observe their Passover without first marking the first day of the first month of the new year through this barley harvest. And this was true with every other feast that fell in line after Passover. This include observing the 7th day Sabbath, the 7th year Sabbath, and the Jubilee. The Hebrews could not observe the next year's calendar in advance, as their calendar was dependent on the barley harvest that dictated to them when the new year began. Do you see how their captivity changed all this, as this observance has become lost to even us now? And there is no way of getting it back, even though some Hebrew scholars have tried to use a computer prediction to predict the new moon of each month. We cannot understand the new year because we do not know dates in our biblical history that the Hebrews had to add an extra month on because the harvest wasn't ready. A computer does not tell us when a harvest is ready. So that's just something to think about, because that is another study all unto itself. And what I'm trying to simplify Hebraic understanding is that the Hebrew way of life, their culture, was centered on food. Not that they worshiped food. They didn't. They didn't worship food, but they used food to honor God and worship Him by using food and specific foods as in representation of Him. The Passover meal was a representation of Jesus, and Jesus likens Himself to bread, as He even says that He is the bread, the manna that fell down from heaven. Interesting. The Hebrews lost their ability to worship God during their time of Babylonian captivity. But oh, how they were allowed to sacrifice food to gods which they didn't know. Daniel asked the guard to feed him and his companions a staple of vegetables and water for a period of 10 days. Daniel knew that eating from the king's table would defile his body because King Nebuchadnezzar sacrificed the first half of the meal to pagan gods. It wasn't just about eating food sacrificed to idols that Daniel did not know. It was about how God's animals were prepared and slaughtered as well. And the king did not observe of any of God's ordinances, so how could he know how an animal was to be slaughtered or how a meal was to be prepared? Food in the king's court was to be freely eaten, as it was freely prepared against God's set regulations. So all this is important. And this is relevant today, as the animals that God created are subjected to horrific slaughter practices that most of us cannot bear to watch, and so it is easier to turn a blind eye. The food that has been given to us by God has been tampered with and presented to us in adulterated forms that defile our bodies the minute we take it into our mouths. Our bodies are called God's temple, are they not? How is the temple revered in old Levitical law? Only the priests were allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. We today are called priests, or the priesthood of Melchizedek. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that name wrong. I don't have the name in front of me. But Jesus is our high priest in that order. We who are temples need to keep our bodies pure and clean. We keep our bodies pure and clean by not participating in sin, in acts of sin. Do you not think eating unwholesome foods because we want, we lust, we desire, we covet, without regard to how the animal was killed, without regard to what was in that food? Do you not think that is sinful if we disregard life in order so that we can have 5 minutes of pleasure? God tells us that we will have to give an account for the lives of the animals that have been killed. And this is something that I talk in my book, because the reason why Jesus had to come back is because the Israelites were not slaughtering the animals with reverence. Their idea was, oh, I sinned today. Okay, well, I'll get all my sin out today and I'll slaughter a cow tomorrow. They were flippant about the lives that they were using instead of their own. That's something else to think about as we continue in the next podcast. So please stick around. There's a lot more to come.